to the God Conclusion. I'm your host, John Leonard. Most of you may know that Max is my meme master. He's the guy that's given me a lot of the great comedic posts that I've been putting on the Facebook page. Max, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I enjoy making people laugh, hence the creative memes that I try to share. And I was born and raised Jewish. First off, I guess I should start with the last name like Sternberg. Makes you scratch your head thinking that's not a usual Christian name. But I was born and raised Reformed Jewish and became Christian shortly after the birth of my first son. I met my wife and a little before that, and she told me under no uncertain terms, if you want to hang out with me on Sundays, I'm going to be at church. And she thought, hey, because he's Jewish, he's only halfway yoked, unequally yoked. Yeah, maybe I could help him get all the way there. And converted to non-denominational Christianity. I'm a big fan of biblical archaeology and researching a lot about Old Testament history. And I am a Christian fantasy author as well, with 2 books self-published and working on my 3rd now. And just trying to be a jack of all trades with my faith. We recently just started a youth ministry as well.
Oh, that's awesome.
Thank you.
One of my questions is, how do you pronounce the last name of Leon? Is it Reese or Rise or
Rise?
Rise. Very good. Tell us a little bit about your novels.
I try to approach a way to have each character have a background that's the hardest background for Christians to evangelize to. And I wanted to have each character also have kind of an archetype that you see in the Bible. So like a prodigal son or a woman at the well, and incorporate all that into a high fantasy setting with a zombie apocalypse setting as well. So it's lots of different things all melded and stirred together. And you have Bible verses incorporated into the story as well and woven through it. And it's really a journey of coming to faith and an adventure journey that is very much a fantastical setting. But it revolves around Leon Rise. And he is an ex-military young man who promptly upon coming home is kicked out. And the only thing that he has really in his possession of any vitality is this spear that's very old that was hanging on his father's wall. And late one night, he dreams a dream, and an angel comes to him in a vision, telling him that he has been called by this forgotten god known as Adonai to become a judge. It's taken from the book of Judges. You have these heroes during a period of time where people did whatever they wanted in the Bible. What was right in their own eyes, I think, is the exact verse. But this is all taking place in a kingdom that is the last kingdom in the world. Everything else has been wiped out by this zombie undead army. And so Leon has to navigate through this world and tell people about this forgotten god while it's ending, while the world's ending. So I particularly like the story, but I'm preferential because I wrote it.
I must confess that I've not read the entire novel. I got a free copy when you were giving them away. And I did read the first couple of chapters, and I was immediately sucked into it. But of course, starting the podcast, maintaining the Facebook page, and trying to write my own novel, which is not a science fiction fantasy novel like you've written, but more of a straightforward detective novel. I grew up watching Perry Mason and that sort of thing. And so my character now in my novel, one of the characters is loosely based on my own personality. But in your book, you've got goblins and dragons and ogres and things of that nature. So I'm wondering how closely you might be identifying with your protagonist.
I think I put a lot of my personality traits into the protagonist. I never, unfortunately, joined the military, but my protagonist did. He was part of the Naval Air Corps. But he's headstrong, he's stubborn, he went his own rebellious ways. He learned in the books from his family. But each character in the story does have depth, personality. You have joking, comedic dwarf, but behind all of that joking, there's a deep-seated pain there, a very harsh backstory of personal loss. So how could someone with that personal loss who masks everything with the joke come to faith? You got to read the books to find out. But we believe in a fantastical story. In history, the Bible itself is the most supernatural book that there is out there. And dragons aren't so far-fetched when you learn of the Hebrew term nakash seraph, which means a fiery flying serpent. Well, what's a fiery flying serpent in English? A dragon. Giants aren't all that far-fetched when you read about things like Nephilim in Genesis 6:4.
Absolutely.
I like the kind of weird aspects and the fantastical aspects of the Bible. I think it really enriches it, especially when you could see some of the tie-ins with ancient biblical archaeology.
How long have you been a Christian?
About 12 years. It was shortly after the birth of my first son. Really came from, it wasn't even like a traditional church in the sense, like my wife, she took me to a house saying we were going to church. What is this? There's no cross on the roof. And so she said, just give it a try. And so we went inside the house and people were mingling and talking to each other. I thought, okay, this is great. And then they said, all right, church is starting. And so they all start going into the basement. And I thought, wait, okay, where have you brought me? What is it? And she said, no, it's a church plant. They broke off from another church and they started one here and just give it a shot. I said, okay, fine. Yeah, I'm a Reformed Jewish guy. I haven't been struck by lightning yet. Let me just go in the basement. And so you've got this dozens of chairs and people singing songs and this drummer, and you've got this nice atmosphere. And all of a sudden we take a seat and this guy 3 feet away stands up and starts speaking in tongues. And I looked at my wife and I said, that's not Hebrew. What is this? Where are you taking me? And like it got everything that could go wrong did go wrong, at least from my perspective. Like they even did communion that day. They said, this is the blood of Christ. This is the body of Christ. My wife turned to me and said, you don't have to do communion. Just, honey, are these cannibals? What's going on? Just stop it. So that was my introduction to Christianity. Fast forward to a couple of years later after the birth of my first son, and I hear the sermon on all the prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. And I've been doing a little bit of reading, a little bit of research, and the pastor starts going into it. And there one particular prophecy that he talks about is how Jesus had to go through this gate. And now the gate today, modern day, it's walled off. So the Messiah had to go through this gate. And then my logical calculating brain, I thought, okay, so all these prophecies were fulfilled. Not one was not done. Something has to give here. Who else could the Messiah be? And then everything just clicked for me. And so when the pastor said, everyone bow your heads, close your eyes, and raise your hand if you accept salvation, and I raised my hand, he said, all right, everyone who raised their hands, open their eyes. And I opened my eyes, and it was just me. Right at me. Yes. But yeah, I got saved after that. I got water baptized shortly after that. And
I've got to interrupt and ask.
Yeah.
Is this the same church where they were speaking in tongues?
Church.
Oh, wow.
This is the same church.
Now, I've gone to some non-denominational churches, and there was one that the pastor was a guy named Jensen Franklin. could just listen to him talk for 2 hours.
Oh yeah.
But the service that went along with the sermon was a bit over the top. I think it was an Easter sermon or Easter service, because they had a live manger scene on the stage, and when they rolled off the stone and Jesus comes out the tomb, they had people on wires that were dressed like angels that flew over the audience. And I was like, okay, I grew up as a Christian. This is way over the top here. Lutherans are a little bit more conservative than this.
Right,
But his message is just believable. Like I said, I could listen to the guy all day. But the trappings that go along with going to a service, it's more like a old tent revival kind of atmosphere than
right.
a traditional church service.
I got to say that hopefully not every church is like that. From my experience, you have a lot of big explosive, like you said, pyrotechnics and smoke machines and all those huge churches that have those huge productions. They get a lot of attention. I think it's like the squeakiest wheel gets the grease. But from my experience, there is a time for reservation and there is a time for celebration. There's worship, there's praise, there is songs of praise. All of that doesn't necessarily need lasers and lights and sound and fog and all that stuff. Sometimes it's praying in your closet and just singing worship songs while you're cooking dinner.
In a basement.
Yeah, or in a basement. And that, I'm sure God would appreciate that as well. You don't need all the fancy stuff necessarily. And while that might attract some who want a concert before their sermon, it doesn't need to be for everybody. But you give them grace. No church really is perfect. 2,000 years ago, they met in houses. There was one church to a city and everyone went. And it would last all day instead of just until the football game. So today it's a lot different than what it was, but I classify as non-denominational, mainly because I would love to see the church get back to the root, get back to the Church of Acts, what it originally was modeled to be.
Amen. That's what we need. You had mentioned the speaking in tongues, and I again had a very similar experience, and it was again in Jensen Franklin's church. But to me, it was like he had suggested to the audience that he said people will be speaking in tongues, and within a couple of minutes, people started doing that. But to my ear, it sounded more like they were just speaking gibberish rather than tongues. And they were very repetitive in what they were saying, but it wasn't any language that I recognized. And it, like I said, it sounded more like gibberish to me. And so in my mind, Jensen Franklin was creating mental, I'm trying to think of the right word for this, and this is where the editor comes in handy, is when got these long pauses, I just cut them all out. But the word I'm trying to think of, it's like he creates a hysterical atmosphere where people are easily led into the experience. And I think in part it's because it's in this very large auditorium setting. There are thousands of people there, where in your case, you had someone also speaking in tongues, but it was in a very much smaller setting, much more intimate setting. And it didn't put you off like the speaking in tongues situation did with me in Jensen Franklin's church. To me, I didn't have anything against Jensen Franklin. I just thought that there were some people in the audience who were easily led astray or easily influenced.
Right.
into doing whatever he said, because he is a very charismatic preacher. And I'm torn there because I really enjoy his message, but it's the whole, you don't have a church feeling. You feel like you're going to a Broadway show instead of going to a church service.
And again, there's that sensationalism that some churches, not even just Pentecostal or charismatic, but some churches feel that it's necessary to have that draw. Now, in regards to speaking in tongues, look, you have a very controversial topic, but I'm just going to tell you that, look, I'm not a cessationalist. I do believe that the gifts of the Spirit are for today, because you do see miracles of healings, you do see casting out of demons, and so everything else would be associated with that. I've prayed in tongues, and while there is some sort of repetitive element for some people who do, I don't know every language. John, you don't know every language.
No, but when you were saying the prayer, did you understand what you were praying?
No, I did not.
Interesting.
But the way that I understand and the way that it was explained to me, because look, if I'm going to do something, let's be frank, it's weird, I'm going to research it. The way that it was explained to me is that this is a prayer language. And so there's different languages. There's our language, there's English, there's Old Sumerian, there's Spanish, there's Proto-Hebraic, and our enemy knows them all, knows all these worldly languages. But a prayer language is a private language between you and God. More, the Bible also says in the New Testament that speaking in tongues, it's not for the believer, but for the unbeliever. There's also different types of speaking in tongues. So there's saying another language, there's the prayer language. Even in the Old Testament, you had, I think it was Samuel's mother, who was groaning in the synagogue. And then the rabbi of that synagogue said, "Go home, woman, you're drunk." She said, "No, I'm just praying for a child." And are we ever going to come to a consensus as a church as to what speaking in tongues is? Probably not on this side of heaven.
Let me clarify that I do believe that people can speak in tongues.
Mhm.
I also believe that people can be influenced into thinking that they can speak in tongues
Yeah.
by a very charismatic leader. And I think that your experience was one, and my experience was unfortunately the other. But it didn't make me more cynical to the idea that people can speak in tongues, because, as I say, love to say, the God of the Bible created this universe from nothing. So when you're talking about speaking in tongues or talking donkeys or talking snakes or anything like that, it's not beyond the realm of possibility. It can happen. I am very fascinated because I didn't realize this. I suspected, but you know how it is, on especially on social media friendships. You don't necessarily want to ask embarrassing questions, but you volunteered that you grew up in a Jewish background. I've got to say, I have always been very interested in, I would say again, if I had it to do all over, I would not have been a Lutheran growing up. I would have preferred Messianic Judaism, because to me, that's the best of all worlds. You believe in the Christ, you believe in the Messiah, but you also, Jesus was a Jew, so you understand the Jewish traditions, which most Christians just stick to the New Testament.
Right.
And they don't realize the richness of the Old Testament and all the prophecies in particular that are related to Jesus. I think there's like 100 or nearabouts that have been fulfilled in the New Testament. It's remarkable.
Oh, yeah.
But people, a lot of people see God as two different gods. The God of the Old Testament is fire and brimstone and a mean and vindictive God, and the God of the New Testament is love and compassion and understanding. And it's Jesus versus Yahweh. and they don't seem to grasp the concept that Jesus and Yahweh are, in essence, the two parts of the triune God. They're the
Yes.
same God. And the
Yes.
God of the Old Testament is not mean and vindictive God. It's just that the Old Testament was written in such a way that the history that is recorded doesn't necessarily favor God all the time. Sometimes the people who the scribes that were writing the scripture were members of a specific tribe. And you can see places where the descendants of Moses wrote an account of a battle scene, say, for example, where Moses is depicted as the hero. And then in another chapter of the Bible, you'll find the same basic story described where Aaron is the hero. So even though the Bible is supernaturally brilliant, there is the elements of human influence, in my opinion, that make us see stories from multiple perspectives. And to me, that's not a detriment or a criticism of the Bible. It adds to the value that it presents, because the Bible is a book we can all relate to, particularly if we study it rather than just cherry picking a chapter and saying, okay, I'm going to read John 3 this week, and I'm going to read
Right.
Genesis 22 this week. To understand what happens in Genesis 22, in my opinion, you have to have just read Genesis 21,
Mhm.
because in that story, and in fact, on the Facebook page not long ago, I just posted some archaeological information that you might find interesting. It was about the well of Abraham. And see, to me, if you read Genesis 21 carefully, I don't think that well should be called the well of Abraham. Think it should be called the well of Abimelech, that Abraham fleeced him out of in this treaty negotiations. And that is the reason why God tested. He had to test Abraham, because Abraham had done this act where he used Abimelech's fear of God to gain favor in this treaty negotiations. And when you look at that that's been dug, the well of Abraham, it's not a trivial matter. A well in the desert's 300 feet underground, and they were digging this thousands of years ago. That was a major undertaking.
Absolutely. No,
And so he got this well for 7 lambs, what he paid Abimelech to take the well from him. So it, to me, Genesis 22, when you read Genesis 21 and you have the story of the well fresh in your memory, and then you come in and it says a while later God tested Abraham, it gives a motive for God testing Abraham. God isn't just doing this in a whimsical nature. He's testing Abraham because Abraham has shown himself to be less than forthright, less than the ideal representative for God, not necessarily worthy of being the father of the nation of Israel, but he ultimately is, because he did show that in Genesis 22, he was willing to pass the test. He was willing to make that sacrifice, because it says in the Bible, it says he got up early the next morning
Mhm.
and took Isaac with him because he had a guilty conscience, in my opinion. Now, what I just said is not in the Bible. You
Mhm.
have to study the Bible and you have to read between the lines to come to that conclusion. But in my opinion, when you do come to that conclusion, it's a logical conclusion. And I've been talking for a while. So now,
No, I think you hit the nail on the head that there is an element of logic that can come into play, especially with a delve into not just what the Bible says, but the context. So, for example, Hebrew tradition can explain a lot of what happens in Genesis, because I grew up the same mindset that you did, that God's this guy in a cloud in heaven and he will smite you if you do something wrong, and he's this vengeful guy. And then all of a sudden here comes Jesus, and it's like, how can these be the two same people? And it really wasn't until I started doing research, and particularly in biblical archaeology, that I was able to find links between, okay, so toughest question, why did God tell the Jews to slaughter these different cultures in the promised land? Not just every man, down to the animals. When you look at what these other cultures were doing and practicing ritual cannibalism and child sacrifice and all of these different things, like the sin of the Amorites, having all these false fallen angel gods that they were worshiping, that were leading other nations away from worshiping the one true God. Okay, yeah, that makes a little bit more sense now. And so you have a richness and depth to the Bible that you can't see on just a surface pass, just reading word for word. If we were to know what was known 2,000 years ago, things would make a lot more sense contextually. So to even throw in the New Testament, when Jesus revealed that he was the Messiah, and Simon, then called Peter, said, "Hey, you are Christ, Son of the living God." Jesus revealed that to them in Caesarea Philippi, which is in the Tetrarch. It used to be known as Paneas. And so the reason it was called Paneas is because where Jesus was telling them this, there was this huge temple to the false Greek god Pan. There's this cave there, and it's there now. People like go to it and see where Jesus preached. But in this temple to Pan, there was supposedly this gate to the underworld, because this spring came up from this cave and then later on joined the Jordan River. And the spring, they couldn't measure the depth in the cave. And so they called this thing a gate to the underworld. People would like throw babies as sacrifices to worship this god Pan right there. And so suddenly this passage makes a little bit more contextual sense, because now you can see Jesus saying, "And the gates of hell shall not withstand the church." There's a gate to hell contextually right behind Jesus as he's telling his disciples this. So now this passage is a little bit more rich.
I never knew that. That's a great story. That's great history. Great information.
Yeah, biblical archaeology is something that will make the Bible more interesting, because Western culture has this stereotype of, oh, it's this nightstand book and I'm going to read my verse a day and then I'll be okay. No, the Bible can be exciting if you delve into it. And if you have questions as to why something is worded the way it is, find out. There's no need to have those questions. Hosea 4:6 says, "My people are destroyed by a lack of knowledge." And so if you don't have the knowledge, seek it.
And you should be in an environment where you don't need to be afraid to ask those questions.
Absolutely.
Right shortly after I got married, I was invited to join a Bible study that was taking place at the house in front of the subdivision. And the couple that lived there, they were friends. Their daughter was friends with our daughter, that kind of stuff. So we socialized with them, but we weren't real close friends. And when I went to the Bible study, I realized it was all the men from this one church that David belonged to. Me, I was the lone guy out. And I'm the type of person that I don't necessarily like to press the limits of conversation, but I like to ask questions and I like to feel like I can make statements that don't lead to me being condemned as a blasphemer for having had the thought. And
Right.
I mentioned that as a child, I had that thought that there were two different gods, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. And you would have thought that I carved 3 6s in his dining room table. And I was never invited back to Bible study. And his daughter told my daughter that unfortunately I was going to be going to hell. That put a little bit of a strain on the friendship. But that's the thing is, even though, and you and we can, I feel like we can talk about a lot of different things because I think we have very similar mindsets. But if you notice from some of the comments that are left by other Christians on the page, not everybody is on the same page with,
No.
I can't tell a flat earth joke. I can't tell a joke about John Calvin. The humor options are very limited in the God conclusion. If that's assuming I don't want to offend anybody, and as we
Right.
both know, there are limits on how far I'm willing to go to keep everybody happy too.
As far as different doctrines and things like that, like I said, I really want to get back to a Church of Acts as a church body. And that means being able to talk about denominational differences in a safe setting where people can respect each other. Your faith, John, is probably going to look a little bit different than mine, but we still worship the same God. We still believe in the same essential things. And the Bible is, I think, one of the men in my men's ministry that I'm part of. The Bible, he put it as an acronym. It's basic instructions before leaving Earth. And so, not everyone's going to take the same elements out of it, but that's why we're called and we're told to delve into the Word, to keep studying Scripture. Because if we don't, we're not running a race, we're standing still.
It's not a destination, it's the journey.
Right. You know the destination, but
Exactly.
it's the journey. You're absolutely right. And as far as your study group goes, it should be safe to open up the tough questions. Like my wife and I, we started a youth group in January called Upper Room Youth Group. And
So y'all moved out of the basement.
we moved out of it wasn't our basement to begin with, but no, we partnered up with the local church as far as the location. And we said, we don't care where kids go to church. We don't care if they go to church or not. If it's ages 12 to 18 and they want to learn more about God and the Bible, they should come. And we have a standard practice of just, hey, if you're new or if you have questions, even if they're the toughest questions that even your parents can't answer, throw them our way, write them down on an index card, and we will research it together.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
And a great resource.
Yeah. Because these kids, one of the next messages that we have is going to be on Ephesians 6, which a lot of Christians know it's the armor of God passage. But we're tying in basic apologetics, which a lot of Western Christians don't know what even the word apologetics means. Being able to defend your faith, being able to discuss your faith and discuss the critical points and being able to talk about it and tell other people about it. There's adults who don't even know how to do apologetics. And so we're going to try and teach these kids how to defend their faith and how to talk about some of the biggest criticisms that people have. And for example, the next message, just a sneak peek for the people who don't see it Monday at 7 p.m. One of the fiery darts that the enemy has and that they like to throw is that because the Bible is so old, because it's been translated so many times, how do you know it's accurate?
Bingo.
The Dead Sea Scrolls really solved that question. They were found in 1947, the basic 7 scrolls. About 30 to 40% of them were scripture from the Old Testament, and pretty much entire copy of Isaiah's scroll was uncovered. And so the Great Isaiah Scroll is what it's called. And Isaiah, the major prophet, had some of the most specific prophecies about Jesus. So we are able to take this Great Isaiah Scroll, that's the oldest that we found, and match it up with the Bibles that we have today and see, this is actually really accurate. So the translations haven't been really lost through time. Are there some things that could have been worded better? Yeah, but that's not detrimental to our faith. So if kids knew this knowledge, then the next time that they go to school and another kid questions them about it, they can fire right back, hey, I know the answer. My faith is still okay. And so we can help these kids get more rooted in their faith, really just polish that armor that they have, and make sure that they're some of the most knowledgeable, wise kids when it comes to their faith.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this Monday because this is going to be the start of this apologetic series. And I can't wait for these kids to know a little bit more about how real the Bible actually is.
We talked earlier about Messianic Judaism, or I should say, I talked about it a little bit, but there's a website on the internet called One for Israel, and it's testimony from Messianic Jews. And I'm always amused when I watch these videos and they say, I thought Jesus was Catholic. I thought he was Italian. And then they sneak into the library and they open up a New Testament and they start reading in Matthew, and they see that it's a book about a Jewish rabbi and it's written by Jews, and everybody in the book is a Jew except for except for Luke. And the thing is, many of these testimonies, they hone in on Isaiah 53. And if you just take that chapter out of the Old Testament, it reads like you're describing Jesus. And that's how many of them came to faith, is they read that and they connected the dots of, this is a prophecy from 700 years before Jesus walked the earth, and it describes him to a T.
Yes. Yeah. And that's not the only part of Isaiah's book that really describes Jesus. There are other parts, but that's the main that chapter of Isaiah was so dangerous to the Jewish faith and Jewish culture with the Sadducees and Pharisees that as soon as they figured out what they had done, they tried to rip that chapter out of Isaiah.
Really? I
Yes.
did not know that.
So there is the book of Isaiah being the major prophet. A lot of what he speaks about does point to Jesus. And you talked earlier about logic. Logic is that a lot of Jews, or at least Reformed Jewish that I came from, if you were to ask them who was Jesus, they'll either tell you he was a magician or that he was a prophet. Hold on, if he was a prophet, then shouldn't we have listened to what he had said?
It's a good point.
Just like the prophet Elijah, and just like Elisha. David, he was called a prophet in Acts. So if we are listening to these prophets, why not Jesus? And so almost taken that Deuteronomy 18 test of a prophet and saying, hey, look, if they're speaking the words from the Lord, they're from me. And if they're not speaking the words of the Lord in Deuteronomy times, they would kill that prophet. And then almost combining it with Galatians, I think it's Galatians 1:7, where, even if an angel comes down and gives you a different doctrine than what is of the Lord's, you are to ignore them. Automatically, if people were to put those two together, you would get rid of a lot of denominations that are popular today and go back to fundamental Church of Acts Christianity.
That's what we need.
That is what we need. Because there's a lot of different deceived people out there. There's a lot of different Jesuses that are being preached now. But we serve one Jesus Christ, and we serve one Yahweh, and we have access to one Holy Spirit. And they're all centered around they're all the same God. They're a triune God. But people aren't going to get that if they don't do the research. And just like Hosea 4:6 says, my people will be destroyed by a lack of knowledge if they don't go searching for it. And so if I had to have a message for all of your listeners, it's be more than the verse a day type of Christian. If you have tough questions, there are answers out there. You just got to look in the right place.
Amen. That was a great message. And let's see, 45 minutes. You want to wrap it up now, or you want to keep going for a little bit longer?
If you've got other questions, I've got answers.
I do have a couple other questions. I want to get back to your novel. When do you expect your third novel to come out?
It's in the final editing stages right now, and then it'll go out to test readers and then put a little polish on it and publish it. Hopefully, knock on wood, it could be done mid this year.
That's very exciting. Because like I said, I did read some of your first book, and it is extremely well written.
Thank you.
You definitely learned from the mistakes that most writers make when they write their first novel and fix those, writing in active tense, and you've got a very exciting story. But I do wonder, when you've got characters named Leon, Lucian, Liara, and Lorik, don't you have any other names that
all in one family? And so
I know.
Yeah, they're all in one family. So I want to create that family tradition. You'll see other quirks later on. So like the dwarven culture, you learned a little bit more about it in book 2. But I wanted to take a part of the body plus a mineral and have that all be the different clan names or last names of the dwarves. And I try to make them interesting. They're a polytheistic culture. They believe in minerals and false gods of minerals. But why worship the created when you could just worship the creator instead?
Interesting. Never thought about worshiping a mineral before.
Yeah. Look, you have...
But people worship a lot of weird things.
They do. And to circle back to that study group that you had, look, if you had a legitimate question about, oh, there are 2 different gods, the Bible itself makes references to multiple false gods. Your friends probably weren't familiar with Psalm 82, and I'm just going to pull it up here. That would make any unknowing Christian kind of scratch their head, because Psalm 82 starts off with, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. Now, you can scratch your head and think, wait, there's a big G God and there's little g gods. What's this psalm trying to talk about? Until you learn more about context, about what people knew 2,000 years ago. And back then, it was common knowledge that all of these different religions, these ancient Mesopotamian or ancient Egyptian religions that worshipped all these deities, Romans, Greeks, these pantheons were all fallen angels that were trying to pull worship away from God unto themselves, because God ordained that because they rebelled against them, they could not be forgiven.
When you say fallen angel, you mean demon, correct?
Yes and no. Demons, as we know it, are, put in simplest terms, evil spirits. Where these spirits come from, there's some contention, but Genesis 6:4 has a reference to Nephilim, and pre-flood, these giants, these fallen angel entities, part fallen angel entities, part human entities, were an abomination. And they were continually bent on evil. And so here comes the flood. Why did God wipe out all the earth with the flood? Because these beings were there and they weren't supposed to be. They were perverting God's creation. And so God wiped them all out in a flood, but their spirits persist as what we now know called demons. But these fallen angel entities, and you see these in this term in the book, these B'nai Ha-Elohim, these little gods, are seen throughout history in different pantheons. So we know that Aphrodite is the same as Venus, but also before that was known as Ishtar or Astarte. It's the same entity, different names throughout history. And then you see other Mesopotamian gods like Enlil or Marduk. These are rebellious entities that rebelled against God and basically said, hey, we're going to form our own religions, or we're going to be worshipped ourselves and lead humanity, God's creation, astray. That's what people knew 2,000 years ago. That's one of the reasons why Jesus went to Caesarea Philippi, parked himself in front of that temple to Pan, which, if you know anything about Pan, he's half human and half goat, depicted with curling horns, and is associated with a lot of worldly pleasures and is reminiscent of the satanic churches worshiping Baphomet almost. It looks very similar and has a lot of similar aspects. But Jesus parked himself in front of that temple and said, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against my church. He's basically saying and declaring war against those pantheons. And so just doing a passive reading when you're half awake, not even sipping your coffee in the morning, of your verse a day just so you can get it out of the way, you're not going to get that.
No, that's not going to come through at all.
But when God has taken his place in the divine council, in the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. When you read that, your first instinct is to think, wait, if there's only one God, why does it say that?
It's funny that you mentioned that, because there's a verse in particular that I still struggle with even today, even after Bible studies and all of this. It's a very simple verse, and I can't remember the exact context in which it happens, but I want to say that the disciples are sitting around the fire and Jesus is talking to them. And at some point he says, haven't I told you that you are gods? And I didn't know what that meant, and I still don't know what that means. But it's the lowercase g.
Right. And there are some denominations who believe that, I'm going to try and PC this, who believe that when we die, we have the ability to become gods and rule our own planet. That is not what Jesus is saying here.
No.
And this can actually tie into Psalm 82. When God has taken his place in the divine council, you see a divine council in multiple places in the Bible. You see it in Daniel, where God consults his divine council, basically saying, hey guys, what are we going to do about Nebuchadnezzar here? And then he starts fielding ideas. This divine council, these are Elohim. They are spirits. They're spiritual beings in heaven, or in this case, on earth, and are given authority over the earth. So there's a view that I hold to called the Divine Council worldview and the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And in a nutshell, at the Tower of Babel, it says quite clearly that he tangles up the languages. And if you delve a little bit more into the context, God has divorced himself from all the nations, and there's 70 or 72 nations, and these spiritual entities, these powers, these principalities, which in other passages are put in authority over these nations. And then God goes to Abraham and pulls Israel out of Abraham. He's my guy. And he tests Abraham, and Abraham passes the tests. And from Abraham will become a multitude of nations that all the earth shall be blessed with. All the nations shall be blessed with. And so with all these different entities, with all these powers and principalities, this is a council. This is a divine council. You know, these are spiritual powers, principalities, and authorities that are holding rule over the earth. And you've seen it talked about recently with all the talk about abortion And, oh, it's people worshiping Molech. Yeah, he is a power. He is a principality. So this is not just way out of left field. And so when God cast all these entities out, what he is saying to his disciples, what Jesus is saying to his disciples and to us through salvation, is that we, humanity, Christians, are meant to replace these entities in his divine counsel. So chilling with God in heaven, because these fallen entities, they've already gotten their judgment, and that's not going to change. You read that further in Psalm 82, and if I could, in the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and to the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And talking about, he's entreating to these entities. He's basically showing up in their courtrooms saying, hey, look, you guys are being unjust. And he says now they have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. And Yahweh says, I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High. So there's that term that you were questioning. All of you. He's saying it to these entities. And then he says, nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. So unpacking this, he's condemning all these entities that are ruling unjustly. And at the end of Psalm 82, you see them saying, arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. You're seeing the reversal of that disinheriting of the nations at the Tower of Babel. You're seeing all the nations coming together, Gentile and Jew, under worship under God. What you're seeing is the beginnings of Acts 2, where now you see all these different tongues spoken, and you see the Holy Spirit come upon 120 people in the upper room. And now they're proclaiming to all the nations, hey, look, this is the true way. This is the true God you should be following.
Tongues of fire.
Tongues of fire. So it is fantastical. And like I said before, it's the most supernatural book that's out there and will ever be. But this is history. And if you don't know it, you're just going to stay confused about those verses. You're just going to stay confused about some of the things in the Bible, but you don't have to stay there.
I don't want to pick on our atheist friends, not too much, because we've had a nice, cordial conversation. But I do hear that common criticism that the Bible was written by basically a bunch of illiterate sheep herders that didn't know how to tie their own sandals. And I mentioned the fact that they found computers that are older than Jesus was. They found this device, it's the Antithecura. It was an analog computer that was found under the water that could do all of these different calculations and functions. These were not stupid people that wrote the Bible. They were very thoughtful people. And they were telling a story that is almost beyond comprehension, but it's so well documented. And, that the critics of the Bible will cherry pick, for lack of a better term, and they'll go and say, God did this. And so that means that the Bible's not true because God's mean. He killed people. And my counter to that is, but what about all the history that we know is in the Bible from the earliest chapters? They have excavated Sodom and Gomorrah and found that those cities actually existed and they were obliterated by a mass extinction event.
Tunguska-like event, I think, is what the scientific report says. It's 70 pages. It came out, I think, last year.
So the evidence, the historical evidence that supports the book that we both believe tells the true story of God has evidence that's exterior to the Bible that documents so much of this and provides so much value.
Yeah. I mean, with archaeology, you can really uncover, pardon the pun, a lot of context to the Bible. Even secular archaeologists can point to the same mound that biblical archaeologists do and say that was Jericho. What the Bible talks about Jericho, that's Jericho. Jericho's been found. And so if you don't know, now you do. Jericho's been found. But what else did they find? They found that Jericho had a wall that basically fell over on the outside, all throughout it, all around it. And that fallen wall provided the ramp for the Israelites to come in and wipe it out. There was a burn layer to Jericho. A burn layer, it's an archaeological term where you see this layer of destruction in the city. And so all the evidence is there that points to the biblical narrative is accurate. But if you don't want to look, that's on you. That's not on Christians.
What happens is people look for evidence that fits into their confirmation bias. And if you look on the internet, there are archaeologists who did earlier excavations of Jericho, and they claim that they found that evidence that showed that the biblical story was not true. So now we have new information that's come forward that seems to verify the biblical story. And so then it's a competition. It becomes a competition of my source is better than your source.
It's a shouting match.
And it, to me, that kind of gives us some insight into the brilliance of God, that he wanted us to have the free will to choose, so that he's given us tons of evidence so that you and I can look at it and see validation of our faith, but someone else can look at that same evidence and say, nah, I'm not convinced yet. They'll won't tell you that there's nothing that you could ever say or do that would convince them, but they just can make that statement that their level of curiosity has not been satisfied by the evidence that's been presented. And so it's at that point I say we've reached an impasse. Not really much point in continuing the argument when then you get into the repetitive of I've already said this, and the evidence shows that there was a big bang. The evidence shows that there was a Sodom and Gomorrah. The evidence shows there was a Jericho. And like you said, it just becomes a point of endless argument. And that's when I say I've probably had about enough.
And even the Big Bang is now called into question. And, this, I think it was last month that some astrophysicists have said the galaxies that are close to the center of the universe are too new for the Big Bang to work. And look, there is a point where facts end and conjecture begins. And the facts state that the Bible's narrative really hasn't been proven wrong. You can't pick apart one piece of the Bible or the Bible as a whole and say, look, this didn't happen. Even extra biblical sources say that Jesus existed.
Absolutely.
Even extra biblical sources say that Jesus died. And then you see 500 witnesses in the Bible say that they saw Jesus after he was resurrected. And so, look, if the rest of the Bible is true, why can't you just accept that as face value? But then again, that goes back into where is your faith? Some people, they have a different measure of faith. And you can present all the evidence that you want, and they're still going to say they want to see Jesus's birth certificate.
That's true.
Yeah.
Sad but true.
Sad but true.
I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation today, Max, and I look forward to having another conversation with you in the future.
And thank you very much for having me. It's been an honor.
Oh, I don't know about an honor. It's been fun, though. And I look forward to talking to you after that third book comes out. I'm going to get my book out and I'll get it over to the editors so that we can start getting into the process that you're reaching the end of. And I also have a 2023 publication date in mind.
There you go.
But I tell you, it's very, very time consuming doing a podcast in addition to maintaining the Facebook page. And it seems like I write about 20 minutes every 3 days.
Wait, what's the saying? The reward for work well done is more work.
Yes.
So I think you're on the right track.
I appreciate all of your help and the Facebook page with the memes. You are a master, and I look forward to more of those.
Thank you. But it's been a pleasure. I hope your fans and listeners enjoyed this conversation. And John, you're welcome to talk anytime, and I'd be more than happy to.
Thank you again. God bless.
Yeah. Have a good night.
You too. Thank you for listening to The God Conclusion. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing to this channel. Join us again next week as we continue to seek truth. Quid est veritas.